Good morning, everybody. My name is Connor, and I'm so excited to be talking to you all today. Now, today we are going to talk about how to build your own aquascape. Now, before we get started, I'll go ahead and tell you that this aquascape is going to be kind of a temporary little viewing, so we'll get to discover some of the cool microorganisms and macro invertebrates in the waters around our areas. Now, you might notice I am wearing a mask today. That's just a reminder to everybody that we will be requiring masks if you are returning to the zoo. And even though I'm in my home, I do have this mask at the ready just in case I share close quarters with anybody. I'm going to keep it down, though, for the remainder of the program because I'm alone today. Now, before we get started, I want to go ahead and cover our community standards. Now, our learning standards are typically about this. They are, we're going to remain friendly and respectful in the chat. We're going to use the Q&A box for relevant and appropriate questions. Now, I'd love to take as many questions as you have. Unfortunately, we only have so much time. We also are going to respond to the webinar topic in the chat. And we do have a moderator in the webinar. Her name is Kim. And today, if she asks you to alter your behavior, you may be removed from the webinar. So just keep that in mind. We want to be respectful and stay on topic because we only have about 20 minutes or so. Now, before we get started, a few of you I see are already sharing, but if you'd like to share where you're calling in from and how many people are calling in with you, that helps let us know how many people we're reaching and where we're reaching, which is pretty cool. Also, at any point, if you do have a question about the program, feel free to put that in the Q&A box. Now, that will be in your black bar, either in the top or the bottom of your screen. You should be able to submit a question about the program there. I'll be able to get to those at the end of the program today. And again, we do have a tech person monitoring, and at the end, we will have a quick enjoyment poll to allow you all to give us some feedback and let us know how we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and spotlight my video so I can see myself better. There we go. Now today we are talking about an aquascape. Now that's kind of a funny name that I gave this activity that we're doing. Essentially what this aquascape is again, a viewing window. Now that being said, just as a reminder, this is a temporary viewing window. So as a zoo employee and as somebody who likes animals in general, it's always a good idea to allow animals to be as safe and healthy as possible. Now, if we are observing animals, today I did bring some from the wild into my home. We are always going to follow our nature etiquette rules. And those go something like this. Number one, if we touch anything in the wild, we want to put it back the way we found it. So when I collected these samples, and we'll talk more about how I did that, I was very careful not to interfere with anything else involved. Now, when I took these samples of water, I did have live animals with them. So it's important for me to remember where I found them and to return them back as soon as possible so they can continue to be safe and healthy in their environment. So all of the animals that you are seeing today will be returned at the end of the program, right back where they were found. And I highly recommend you doing the same if you choose to do so at home. Now let's see where some of you are from. I see some people from St. Louis, Quincy, okay, Granite City, oh, Springfield, very cool. All right, we have Julian, an 8-year-old from St. Louis, Missouri. We have Champaign, Illinois, very cool. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy you joined us, and I hope you have fun today with this program. It should be pretty cool. So I'll go ahead and show you. This is one little sample I got recently. Now, it's very important to note that when we look at these samples, you might notice there's a lot of gunk in this jar. It's not just clear water with a few things floating around in it. What I did is I collected a lot of things that animals would be found in. And we'll talk more about what I found here. But an important thing to note is when you're taking in sample, again, it's important to not interfere with the environment too much, but it is a good idea to collect some plant life or maybe some sticks, anything that itty bitty animals might be living on. So I can see right off the bat a few little critters. That little gray blob is something we'll talk about in a second. We have a snail way up here, all kinds of stuff that are making themselves more visible as I let that jar sit. Now again, when we're handling this, we have to remember there are small animals here. So we're not going to shake the jar, we're not going to move it, we're going to be very delicate, treat it just like they were in that pond, and if we do things right, they might not ever notice that they were gone. Is that really small? So let's start with our presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. We're actually going to start with a quick poll. Now, I am in St. Louis, Missouri, and in your area, because we're all either from St. Louis, Missouri, or Illinois, it looks like, we all have very similar animals to be found in our freshwater areas, ponds, lakes, rivers. But there are a few animals that are found in these areas that might be surprising to you. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. and you tell me what you think. Now, which of these freshwater animals is not found in Missouri? So there are three options. We have jellyfish, plankton, and shrimp. Now, in my head, when I hear those animal names, I think of the ocean. So it's a little odd to think that jellyfish or plankton or even shrimp could be found all the way in landlocked Missouri. So I'm seeing a lot of answers. I'll give you a few more seconds. Really think about it. Have you ever seen a jellyfish away from the ocean? Or what about a shrimp? I know I love to eat shrimp, but I don't think I've ever caught one in Missouri in my backyard or a pond. Okay, so it looks like we have pretty much all the votes in. Let's go ahead and share that. Okay, so we said there are not jellyfish found in Missouri, but a good amount of us also said all three of those are found in Missouri. Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that all three of those are found in Missouri. Believe it or not, we do have freshwater jellyfish, freshwater plankton, and freshwater shrimp all found in Missouri, which is pretty cool. These are animals that, you know, I go outside, I go fishing a lot, but I hardly ever see, and I wouldn't think that they are there. Now, that's why we think I think this aquascape is incredibly cool. What I did is I took a big scoop of water from a local pond that I like to fish. And now I didn't find any jellyfish personally, but they are absolutely a sight to be found in a lot of the United States. Now, if you look at my PowerPoint here, you can see that those green states are where freshwater jellyfish have been found. So it's actually very common in the main states. Now, a quick note about freshwater jellyfish is that they were introduced. So they were not native originally to the United States, but they are very common and they are widespread throughout the main United States there. Now, these freshwater jellyfish might be a surprising idea, but they are incredibly small and they're also harmless to humans. So if you're worried about swimming in a pond or a river nearby, don't worry about it. These jellyfish actually spend the majority of their life as polyps, which are basically a larva form. We'll talk a lot more about larvae. But the basic idea of these jellyfish polyps is that they're stuck to things like logs and maybe sticks or rocks for the majority of their life. They have itty bitty tentacles that stick out and they grab plankton out of the water. Very similar to how corals and other kinds of animals feed in the ocean. Now, when they do reach adulthood, they are able to let go of that log and they actually use their bell to kind of, the technical term is not bloop, but that seems like an appropriate term. They kind of flex their body and are able to go up in the water column. Once they get close to the surface, they let go. They slowly fall down and all of their tentacles catch food as they come down. So it's a very interesting way to feed. Now we're going to talk a lot about the food cycle on itty bitty terms because believe it or not, these animals are incredibly important. Now jellyfish are a good bridge between plankton and the animals that jellyfish eat. So these jellyfish are eating plankton. They're getting their bodies bigger, and other animals are able to eat the jellyfish. Animals like fish or turtles or even crawdads. So without jellyfish or other invertebrates eating plankton and making their bodies bigger, those other animals wouldn't have animals to eat. So they're very important. Now, just to show you the size comparison, here's one of these freshwater jellyfish next to a penny. They only get about a ½ inch to maybe an inch at the most. They're very, very small. I'm going to go ahead and check my chat because I see a few messages here. Okay, let's see. I see. I had no idea they were so common. Bloop is a great term. Thank you so much. Makes perfect sense. Okay. All right. Now they are very tiny. They're pretty small animals. It's a little surprising. Chances are you might not ever see one. And if you swam with one, you would never know it. Their tentacles are too small to really penetrate human skin. So they can't sting us like some of the ocean jellyfish can. Okay, now the next animal is a close relative of jellyfish. These are called hydrozoans, or for short, we call them hydras. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, you might know about the story of the Hydra, where if you cut off one of its heads, 2 heads grow in its place, and so on and so on. It has all kinds of heads. So that's where they get this name. They have all kinds of cool, far-reaching tentacles, and each one is very similar to a jellyfish stinger. So they actually reach out and they will latch onto little plankton and bring them back into their mouths. Very similar to jellyfish. And actually, again, very close relatives. So we see some pictures of the hydras. Now, I unfortunately did not find any hydras or jellyfish in my water samples, but I really wouldn't expect to. They're pretty hard to find. And typically, like we see in that bottom picture, they're latched onto plants and stems and roots kind of deeper down where I wasn't willing to reach into the pond. Now, hydras are a really cool sight, and again, they are an important branch between plankton and larger fish that might eat the hydras. Our next one is bryozoans. Now, before I tell you anything about bryozoans, go ahead and tell me in the chat, what do you think that looks like? I've heard some interesting, silly comments from me or my wife or friends. When I first found a bryozoan, I didn't know what it was, and I thought it was an alien egg sac, something from another planet full of babies that were going to pop out. It was very mysterious. But I did a little research, and I was really happy to see that bryozoans are actually incredible animals, and they're not that uncommon. Okay, I see an acorn, a colony of some type. That's a great observation. A pangolin. Okay, I could see that with the scales. Yeah, maybe a rolled up pangolin or a coconut, a giant acorn. I love these answers. These are great. Now, when I look at this bryozoan, I see, yeah, mushy and maybe eggs of some kind, but this animal is actually a colonial organism. So someone said a colony of sort, and they were absolutely correct. What a colonial organism is essentially a bunch of identical animals working together as one. So they almost are like single-celled organisms coming together to make a multicellular one, just like us. But they're not cells, they're their own organism. So on the right here, we have that organism, which is a zooid. Now that's a very, very small baby that had just hatched from an egg. But when they grow, they grow, they soak up water, they get bigger, and then they replicate themselves. They can clone themselves, or they can even combine with other zooids, and they will form this big mass. Now they're typically kind of a rare sight. They're deeper in the water. Usually they're latched onto the bottom of docks or trees or rocks that are very far down. But when we find them, it's usually when the water reduces and they're left behind. Now, these animals are also filter feeders. So just like the jellyfish and the hydra, they're using very, very small, what are known as kind of raspers. They filter out the plankton from the water and they bring that into their mouth. So they're doing that constantly. But here's the thing. Now, if each one of those little balls in that mass is a zooid, how are the ones in the very middle getting any food? They're actually transferring it to one another. So the outside zooids work as feeders. They grab all the plankton and they bring the nutrients into themselves and then to their zooid friends that are inside. The zooid friends are functioning on a different way. They're maintaining the health of the whole mass. So if one on the outside is getting sick, one on the inside will send them some antibodies or something to help them, whereas the outside ones are feeding themselves and others. So it's a very cool colony that works together almost like ants or, again, like a multicellular organism of sorts. It's very interesting. Now, they do function a lot like coral, but they are not very closely related to corals or sponges. They're kind of their own little category. So I went down a whole rabbit hole. I learned a lot about these guys. And even though they're still a little confusing to me, they are fascinating. Okay, now we're going to talk about larvae. Now, larvae is just a funny word for the animal before it reaches adulthood. So a good example of a larvae could be a grub that turns into a beetle or a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. But when we're talking about aquatic animals, we don't typically think of butterflies and beetles. Now, there are a few aquatic caterpillars and even aquatic grubs, but I'm going to talk about some of the more common larvae we'd see in the water, some of which I've actually found in my own experience. Excuse me. I love that scientific name for the bryozoan, Gigantus acornis. Was that it? I missed it. Oh, what a great name. Gigantus acorneus. I love it. Okay. Now let's get into our first larvae. Now this one is a mayfly larva. Now this is a very common bug that only shows up in spring and summer. So we call it a mayfly because it usually hatches around May. But before that, they are larvae and they're living in the water, hunting things like plankton and other smaller larvae. They're feeding themselves to get big enough to become adults. When they become adults, they hatch out of the water and they fly away and they have these big wings and long tails. Now, this is a very common sight among fly fishermen. If you've ever known somebody who likes to fish for trout, you probably know somebody who has made mayfly lures because they are an important food source for all kinds of fish. So when they fish, they put out a lure that looks just like a mayfly and those fish will go for it because they are constantly eating these mayflies when they hatch. And it's a very, very good food source. So not just the larva, but the adult helps feed other animals. And they also keep a good balance in the ecosystem themselves. Now, this little one is a crazy animal. This is called a caddisfly larva. Now, caddisflies are known for having an incredibly special silk that they produce. Now, it works so well, it can hang all of the rocks that are wrapped around the caddisfly's rear end together underwater. Scientists are using caddisfly silk to actually use in medical research to help connect bones and injuries within the body, because this silk is so durable and resilient and water resistant that it's better than any tape or any staples or metals that we've been able to kind of help our bones regrow with. So very, very special, innovative animals. They use those rock coverings to keep them from floating away in river currents. So what they do is they grab onto a pebble, they glue it onto themselves, they glue another pebble to that pebble, and now they have a big paperweight to keep them down and a nice home to keep them safe. It's an incredible adaptation that they have. Now here's what the adult looks like, the caddisfly adult. They almost look like a moth. So they're very similar to Lepidoptera, which is the butterfly and moth family, but they are not Lepidopterans. So they are not moths and butterflies. However, they are close cousins. Now down here is the Dobson fly larva and adult. Let me check our chat really quick before I go on. Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're all seeing these. Good. Now the Dobson fly is a big predator of mayflies and caddisflies. So here's some little larva conflict here. Within the larva world, there is even predation and prey and everything. Now Dobson flies are very well known for those mandibles. You can see, now that's a worm that's about, I shouldn't say a worm, a larva that's about 3 inches long. Those mandibles are large, but that is a female. Males have even larger mandibles that don't actually allow them to pinch with. So this female, as a larva and as an adult, could pinch you with those pinchers. However, they're only an adult for about a week. They spend most of their lives as larvae. The males have really big mandibles, but they can't pinch with them. They're so big, they can't even use them anymore. They just are for show. So the females choose the males with the biggest pinchers, even though the males can't really use them for much other than kind of flinging each other off of trees. If they wanted to squeeze with them, it'd be too hard. So interesting animal there. Another rare sight, but a very welcome one for anglers. Believe it or not, these Dobson fly larvae have a funny nickname for being fish bait. Now here's the dragonfly life cycle. Another very common larva and pupa is the dragonfly. Now I love dragonflies. I think they're really impressive animals. They can fly more accurately and precisely than most other animals. They can grab their prey out of the air and eat it without ever landing. Very efficient hunters and great underrated predators of the bug world. But the larvae are even more cool. The larvae have a special mouth that shoots out at their prey. So if you've ever seen the movie Alien, now I hope a lot of us haven't because we're probably younger than the appropriate age to see the movie Alien, but if you have, you know that those aliens have a mouth that can shoot out and grab people. Believe it or not, that was inspired by a real animal, the dragonfly larva. So they have an extra lip that can shoot out and actually grab. Some of them have pinchers, some of them don't. They just scoop. But they can shoot out and grab their prey. Now that could be something like a mayfly larva or just plankton, depending on the size of the dragonfly. Very good predators, very underrated in my opinion. And our last one might look familiar to you all. These are a bunch of larvae sitting on the surface of the water. Does somebody want to tell me what this animal looks like, what it reminds you of? I bet we could name it. Ooh, I'm seeing some cool messages. Sounds kind of like a silkworm. Yeah, that caddisfly is a lot like a silkworm. They make a special silk and they stick on to themselves. Did you know they live 2 days? Oh, cool. Okay. Now this last larva we have, oh, somebody said it looks like an upside down spider. Yeah. Now these are actually mosquito larvae. They might not look super familiar to us. As far as I know, these are the ones found in our area, but the ones I found in my personal collection didn't look like this. So here's the adult, the mosquito. Now that's a very common, probably all too familiar animal for us. Now when we talk about bugs, that's usually one of the last ones that people want to talk about. It's not a favorite, right? Nobody likes an animal that wants to suck your blood. But believe it or not, only the female mosquitoes suck your blood. So 50% of their population, the males, are actually pollinators. They're responsible for keeping a lot of flowers and plants alive and pollinated. So as much as we dislike mosquitoes, it is important to have them in our ecosystem. Okay, now I'm going to show you a quick video. And let me go ahead and optimize my sharing just to make sure this video plays well. Now what we're seeing is a very, very tiny animal moving and a few others slowly moving around. Now this was a video I took just yesterday of a sample I collected and returned the day of. Now you can see all kinds of snails and itty bitty animals moving. You might even be able to see some moving on the surface of the water. Now go ahead and tell me in the chat what you're noticing. I'm seeing all kinds of little tiny things swarming, some kind of wiggly, squirmy, worm-like animals, some snails. Let me rewind just a little bit. Now right here is where I wanted to stop. Let's go ahead and check our chat. Okay. So we said, yes, slow movement. There's some snails in there. It's its own tiny little world. You're absolutely right. There's all kinds of animals in there. And I won't walk us through every single one, but there's one I wanted to point out that I only noticed very recently. Now this one, I don't know if you can see my mouse circling it, but right in the center of our screen, we see a big piece of wood sticking out of the water. And in the middle of that wood is what looks like kind of a fuzzy worm. Now that fuzzy worm is actually an aquatic caterpillar. I had to do a little research to find out, but believe it or not, I did have a caterpillar mixed in with all my other animals. I was very surprised to see that. I was expecting things like snails, but not a caterpillar. So that's just a little example of the things you could see. Now, earlier we said it was its own little world. There's all kinds of things swarming in the water. Now look very closely and tell me if you can see some tiny white dots moving around those snails, or maybe in the deeper water. On the right, there's a bunch of them stuck to the glass moving around. Now those tiny white dots are called Daphnia. And Daphnia are some of my favorite Missouri residents. They are a freshwater plankton called a water flea. So they're not actually fleas, but they are called water fleas because of the way they move. Now what they're doing is they're very quickly kind of shooting around almost like a shrimp. And they're using those long arms to sift out all of the plankton in the water. So what these Daphnia do is they provide an incredible food source for very small fish and other animals and invertebrates like the larvae we were talking about. Mayfly larvae love to eat Daphnia. But the Daphnia are also helping convert the smaller plankton, the nutrients from the water, whether it be from algae or floating around microscopic organisms. They're converting all that energy into energy for larger animals. So without a bridge animal like the Daphnia or the jellyfish to eat the microscopic organisms, there wouldn't be any fish or food for the larger organisms. So very cool, very important part of every freshwater ecosystem is plankton, believe it or not. I love these observations. We're saying it looks like a gelatinous blob with arms. I like that. It's kind of true. And they look real chubby. One of them looks like a dog on an egg. I could see that. Yeah. Now they are kind of chubby looking, but that round body allows them to fit tons of eggs so they can have a lot of babies all at once. Now I do have a better video of some mosquito larvae and Daphnia mixed in. So I'll go ahead and share that really quick. You can see all the little white dots moving around. And lots of red mosquito larvae. Again, I said my mosquito larvae didn't look like our picture. Mine were kind of red looking. But you can definitely see all of the Daphnia swarming around in that water. This is very healthy water. This tells me there's a lot of nutrition for the Daphnia, which means there's a lot of food for fish in the lake I harvested from. Now the next one we're going to talk about is Planarians or flatworms. These are some of my favorite little guys. I was not expecting to find any, and I found tons in the water that I collected over the last couple of days. Now, planarians are not like earthworms. They are their own family of worms that are not segmented. So they are called flatworms. Now, segmented worms are called annelids. And that basically means they have lots of lines going down their body. So there's itty bitty sections of their body that you can differentiate. Now, flatworms are really special. They have a superpower. So in the top right of my slide there, you can see that just like hydras or a lobster claw, you are able to cut off a piece of a planarian and they will regrow into a full planarian. Now, this is really special because I used to think earthworms had this ability, that you could break an earthworm in half and it would turn into 2 earthworms. But that's not true. Only one of those earthworms would survive because only one of them has the true mouth part to be able to feed. But planarians are able to regrow all of the parts they're missing to become a fully functioning animal again. It's a very special superpower. In fact, planarians have been known to regenerate an entire body from a section of their body that was cut into 279 pieces. That's crazy. If you were to cut me into 279 pieces, there's not a chance that I would regrow anything. It's just not possible. It's a very special superpower that planarians and also hydras have. So if you take one section of their body, they can regrow the rest. Very cool animals. Now, I was lucky enough to get a video of a planarian, but it's a little hard to see. So I'll go ahead and describe it. This little great blob on top of this. Try not to expect the red mosquito larva. It's that little gray worm we're looking at. Now, if you look at the way they move, they're not like an earthworm. They're not inching along or squirming. They're using microscopic hairs to row their way through the water so that they move very smoothly. It's kind of a special thing that we don't get to see very often. I'll play that clip again because it was a little difficult to see. So you might notice this little gray blob there. And they're moving very slow in our mind, but at that size, that's actually a very fast moving worm. And I'll show you again their close up. So at the bottom, that's kind of what we're looking at. That's more the species that I found, the planarian. Okay, now our last slide of the day. Bear with me, guys. We're almost there. We have a few really cool macro and micro invertebrates to get to. Now, the first one I want to talk about is diatoms. Diatoms are found everywhere in the world, and they are incredible organisms. Some of them are single-celled, some of them are multicellular, but they are essentially algae. A lot of people don't know algae is actually a protist and not a plant. So they have silica cell walls, and they are able to conduct photosynthesis for their energy, but they are not exactly like plants. They function a little bit differently than plants or animals. But diatoms are incredibly special. They make up a huge amount of the dirt found at the bottom of the ocean. And we call that diatomaceous earth, which basically means dirt made of diatoms. Now, for a while there, diatomaceous earth was recommended as a healthy food trend, a very superfood kind of thing. I will tell you right now, I do not recommend this. I said earlier, their cell walls are made of silica, and silica is not a chemical you want in your body. It can be very sharp and function like glass. Simply not something you want to consume by any method. But it is an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. That diatomaceous earth can be munched on by animals that need to grow a hard shell, and that silica going into their body can be used to grow protection for animals like crabs and lobsters and even other crustaceans that are involved, like shrimp. Now, diatoms are another great example of plankton that are filtered out by animals like Daphnia and filter feeders like fish and whales in the ocean. Now, a stentor is another cool macro or micro invertebrate, depending on the species. Now, some can be seen without a microscope, some cannot. But all stentors are very, very good hunters. They're basically a mouth that can jut out and swallow anything about as big as itself. And then they can move on, latch onto a new spot, and start over again. Very good little hunters, but essentially like a big vacuum cleaner that sucks up any food that comes by. Similar to a hydra, but they don't use their tentacles to latch on. They actually use little hairs to kind of suck in things and slurp them up on a microscopic level. Now, a copepod is very similar to a Daphnia. They are also crustaceans, but they're kind of cousins. So Daphnia are closer to shrimp, and copepods are closer to isopods, like roly-polies and things like that. Copepods are very, very cool animals that are very similar to Daphnia. They filter out plankton and things like that from the water. And there are also arachnids found underwater. Believe it or not, there are mites, close relatives to spiders, that live underwater and can either feed on plants or even animals. Some of them are parasites to fish. Some of them just eat plants, depends on the species. Now I have one last video to show you and we're going to wrap our program up. Now this video is a mystery animal. When I first saw it, I thought it was another flatworm. But I can tell you right now, this is not another flatworm. If you look at the way it's moving, it's not like the first flatworm we saw on the surface of the water. It's reaching out. Now, what do you all think this animal could be? I was stumped for a long time. Now we can see it's worming its way through all these Daphnia in the water, but it's not trying to eat them. It's interested in something else. Okay, now did we have any guesses on what that animal was? Ooh, I see a tadpole, a worm. Whoa, what a creature. I see leech and clam. Great guesses, everybody. Now that was a leech. And I'm glad to have confirmed that before sticking my finger in the water. Not that I'm too afraid of them latching onto me, but I was very surprised to find not just one, but many leeches in this section of water I harvested. So again, remember, we do follow our nature etiquette rules. Even though it's an animal that some people might consider gross or scary, I'm going to return it back to its home, just like I would any animal, because it has a right to live as well. So I'm going to bring those leeches and all my other animals back when I'm done with this program today. But I was very surprised to find a leech. The reason I knew it was a leech is because it was an annelid, which was the segmented worm. So not a planarian with the long flat body that has no segments, but a segmented worm closer to an earthworm. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and get to our Q&A, and I'll go ahead and give you our enjoyment poll while I'm doing that. So if you'd like to let us know how we're doing, how you enjoy the program, feel free to answer now. Now our question in the Q&A box is, what is your favorite animal that you collected and put in the jar? That's a great question, Padmini. Now I didn't purposefully collect anything. I didn't go out and grab something and put it in the jar. I kind of just scooped and hoped there was stuff there. But I will say my favorite thing that I spotted was probably the flatworm. I've never seen one in person. It was really special to have dozens at one point on top of the surface swarming around together. Unfortunately, I didn't get a video of all of them together at the time. Well, thank you all so much for answering our enjoyment poll. Now, if you're ever interested in seeing more videos from the zoo, please feel free to check our website, our YouTube page, our Instagram, our Facebook. They're all out there. There's a lot of good footage from our zoo animals and our educators as well. Now, just a reminder, the zoo is open again. We are asking people to bring cloth masks and make a free reservation time ahead of time, just so we can keep our numbers to a safe capacity. Thank you again, everybody.